Okay, so I would like to welcome Ellen Gallagher here. We're going to have a conversation, but just to give a short intro, Ellen Gallagher is an artist based in Rotterdam. So thank you for flying in for the conference today. She has a very extensive CV, so I'm just going to mention a few shows that have happened recently in the UK. She last showed here in a solo exhibition at the South London Gallery in 2009. Also at Tate Modern in a group presentation called Passages from History in our collection galleries in 2008, I think it was. And then a solo exhibition at Tate Liverpool and travelling to the Hugh Lane Gallery in 2007, which was called Coral Cities, and I think we're going to talk about some of the work that was in that show today. And then also a group show in 2007 again called Alien Nation at the ICA in London. So those are some of her most recent presentations here in Britain. But just a way of putting her work in context. So, first of all, Ellen, I wanted to ask you, what forms of drawing and drawing practitioners have most influenced you, and what kinds of drawings do you look at?
I guess I look at a lot of things that are not necessarily considered drawing, and lately a lot of lens-based stuff. But when I was thinking about drawings that I have been really struck with that have stayed with me, I think of, I hope I don't pronounce his name wrong, Ian Keir?
Ian Keir, yes.
Keir, and actually, you know, especially his drawings related actually to his travels in Asia, where he remakes models of a whole city block, or the way he just suggests a kind of, you know, the way he uses like expanses of really fragile material, like gold leaf, but just strung to itself. And I think I'm loud enough. I have a big booming voice. Anyway, and you know, and even though the work is so suggestive, I couldn't imagine anything more specific. You know, I couldn't. I mean, I haven't been to these places he's traveled and he's rendering, but I couldn't imagine a more specific rendering. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that what he's making me do with anticipation that I'm really excited by. David Shrigley, I think about a lot because of the unease in his work, that they're just right up on the surface. So I'm thinking of his woodblocks and even his books, you know, and so this kind of sequence and always, even when they're in small book form, besides the wit, the odd sense of positive and negative space and the way the image floats on the page so that it seems as if, you know, even though he's working really intuitively and so symbolically, so clearly, you feel like you imagined it. And at the same time, you know, something like a woodblock of a carrot, it takes you a while to sort of look at it and say, what is it? Yeah. You know, I mean, it's yeah.
But what you're mentioning two very, very different kinds of drawing practice, one of which is really an expanded form of drawing practice, which makes a lot of sense in terms of your work, particularly the image we have deluxe on the screen at the moment, but also with Shrigley, it's much more graphic and actually.
But I do like it. But it's not about the So in a sense, it's not about what it looks like. Yeah. It's about what it makes me do. Mm-hmm. And so another example would be, you know, not in a sort of academic approach, but looking. I realized one thing I've been looking at a lot over and throughout my practice since about '95. Our Chinese landscape paintings from the 10th century, so Northern Song, and especially this one artist, Fan Quan, and the way that he uses this, again, this idea of anticipation to come up with a giant expanse that would be impossible to see with the eye. Yeah. He first acknowledges a kind of limit of the human eye, and then he uses these blank spaces to create distances between you know, viewpoints of valleys that you would never see next to several mountain peaks, and you know, travelers down one nook, and he creates sort of separations by mist or blank spaces, and the blank spaces allow for these shifting vantage points, and so the viewer literally can hop, or has to, if they to hop from one, using these blank spaces, one viewpoint. So it's an additive technique, and also Stanley Brown, who's a Dutch artist that I think of in terms of this 10th century. So it's really you know, very democratic, I guess, my take. I mean, Stanley Brown in particular, I'm thinking of these pages, these notes of paper that he places on the city streets, and in a predetermined order, and that the viewer, they get walked upon in this predetermined order by random people, and then so it's not just that, in that he doesn't call them drawings, he calls them works, and then he's a contemporary of Jan Dibbets and Bas Jan Odder, and he shows them in vitrines, so that you're always in the vantage point of the action that was made, and they're also kind of time capsules. And he also doesn't define himself. I mean, that's really interesting to me, that he in a sense is complicit in his invisibility, which probably would, you know, we might say might happen anyway, but he plays a role in it by, you know, you're not allowed to say, you know, his age, you're not allowed to say much about his ethnic background at all, and in a sense he's using, you have to project forward in terms of what these things are and how they were made and what that might mean, and I think he's, in a sense, through invisibility, kind of escaped earlier historic reading that might have pigeonholed him, and so that he's able to project his work forward. So I think with those four artists, I feel like I'm talking about something that is, you know, about memory and anticipation.
But also looking across different kinds of styles, traditions, contexts for the source material that you're, or inspiration for the way that you might. I wonder if that's
because I didn't go to graduate school. I'm just doing the best I can. You know what I mean?
But it's a sort of a lack of seeing things with a lack of boundaries, I think. Another thing I wanted to ask about was the quality of visual density in your work. And whether this is a way to me it seems like a really effective way to express a semantic density, a density of meaning, the complexity with which you approach drawing, and I think we get a sense of that through, you know, the range of the sources that you've just mentioned, and the kinds of work that you look at yourself. You use a wide repertoire of techniques and materials, often layering, and also using unconventional, or apparently unconventional materials, and whether this is also about challenging a sense of a singular history as well.
Well, speaking of, we can speak maybe directly about this work. This is a grid of Deluxe, and it's magazine, well, it's made up, but it's based on an archive I've collected of 30 magazine pages, black photo journals, what were called race magazines in the 30s. And my collection or archive that I use and reuse starts in about 1932 and moving through World War II, civil rights, Vietnam, and sort of stopping at the height of the Black Power movement as it starts to also be really co-opted by advertising. And so this grid is actually based on that archive. And we could go to the next, well, exactly, back three. Back three. No.
Another one?
Go forward. Okay. Back through. Oh, so we're not, were we at the end?
Yeah.
Oh, did we not have the details of Deluxe? The grid. No, I believe you. Yeah. I just wonder where the details of. Keep going back. Maybe they're further back. Sorry, I thought they were right there. These are all image details, but there are. If you keep going, yeah, one more here. Yeah. Okay. So this is the, starting at the left-hand side, this is, you know, 1/3 of the work. And it's made up of, it's an edition of 20, and it's made up of 60 different pages. And you know, what I call a page is I should say, the way I would make it, this work came out of a series of drawings I did directly on top of magazines that might have looked like this. But what I found is, as I have an additive practice, I'm interested in this sort of and that they would get to a kind of density in the collage where they would become, I wanted them to maintain a lucidity, that they could be somehow entered. So the grid of Deluxe, you know, is really, each page is its own stage, but at the same time, I don't want any page to fall away or to become the more pronounced page.
So it's about creating that all over.
Yeah, that density.
That density, and it draws you into. But
also not to the point of complete. I don't. There's a lucidity or an elasticity between the things that the pages that I want to maintain. And what I found with what was interesting here was the intervention of the plate. So I would build up the drawings to that state of, like, just on the edge of lucidity, where I could really read into it still. And then I would take a photographic image, and using, you know, photogravure, you know, 19th century technique, I would then flatten the image out and then start over again into it. So what you're looking at might not even be a page, might be, you know, or it might, you know, it's completely fake, and the paper, it's not really as if I've done this 2 magazine pages. You know, there's maybe several layers of really thin, translucent Japanese handmade papers or whatever I felt like using that could give me that kind of magazine effect, but they are completely fake, and so there's this kind of fake language in them, but at the same time, so there's this balance between, or non-balance between, what I'm bringing, my stories or limits, and then there's this my lack of readability in some my lack of knowledge about the material I'm orchestrating, and then also there's the historical material there that is going to be readable beyond me. So, for instance, in the top, the third from the left, The Man Who Kept Harlem Cool, just to explain the way I would work. That was originally, underneath it, it mentions Captain Lloyd Seeley, this really promising young policeman. That name didn't mean anything to me. I was responding to the fonts. And underneath it, I was also really responding to the riots in Harlem from 1963 of a burnt-out city street. And it's this ashen gray, and then I like this sort of like fiery font, you know, that they used. And so I remade this portrait of who would be this man who kept Harlem cool, you know, and so in a sense I obliterated the street scene and kind of collapsed that geography into the geography of this portrait of this man, a totally imagined portrait. I don't think that's what he looks like at all. And then his head has this top of, you know, his afro is made with these blobby plasticine forms, you know, that kind of relate to each other spatially as you move across, but in his, it has a kind of topographical feeling of rivulets and so it's almost somehow the street has become this almost benign sight in his hair. I just mention that because when I have shown this work now, it's been reproduced and it's been shown publicly in museum settings, and people have recognized that's the most recognizable character that I've made. I didn't know him, but people have said to me, oh, of course, Captain Lloyd Seeley. He turned out to be the first, you know, African-American chief of police in New York, and he's a scholar now, and about civil disobedience. He's an incredibly important.
You've learnt the history subsequent to the making of the work, which is
and that in sense this isn't it's not about him, because, you know, that's clearly readable, but it's at the same time it's about this overlay between what I'm coming with and the material, and the portrait, if you will, is that third space, that overlay in between those, and that's what the density for me is about, is that you create a space or a portrait that exists only in that elastic moment between what's coming together. So it's actually maybe not even on the page, do you know?
Yeah, and this sense of distant oscillation between the recorded histories and something else which is going on in the artwork, which is invention and creation. And,
yeah.
Your work also relates to scientific conventions, to both of looking at illustration, particularly in a particular case, marine biology, but and you appropriate and intervene and transform those kinds of materials. So what role does scientific rationalism and its forms and conventions have in your work? Should we go
now to number one?
Yeah,
Thank you.
should we go back?
And then we can just move forward as we like. But yeah, number one. So this is actually addresses that in some ways. This is a portrait, an X-ray of Mrs Ronkin's hand, who is the wife of the man who discovered the X-ray in 1895. And if you go to the next slide, if it's possible.
I don't know what this thing is popping up as I'm technicians ever.
Oh.
Doesn't like.
So this is an actual X-ray, and this is actually made by Jacob von Narkowitz Jodko in 1896, and the title's really great. A fluvia from an electrified hand resting on a photographic plate. And he was a geophysicist who specialized in studying cosmic radiation. So he's interested in background radiation, or the idea of noise in the universe left over from the Big Bang that's still traveling. And the X-ray led him to think, well, if we are part of this, then we must be still transmitting. And so this is obviously a kind of faked aura photograph, which starts to so this relationship between science and fiction is really, I'm really interested in science fiction, as you know, but I was thinking this is something I'm looking at a lot lately in terms of drawing these early photographs that I think are interesting. And the next one is James Van Der Zee. This is the funeral of Blanche Powell, and so there she is superimposed, sort of floating ghost-like in earlier days above the mourners. And then the next slide. This is a wedding portrait, and you see that the child sitting next to them is just sort of might happen, And one of the things I like about this is it's so obviously constructed, and and this idea of like this understanding all of a sudden through science that maybe there was something that the human eye couldn't catch, and that there must be a way to represent that. Or he often does this also in terms of loss, not just the funerals, but from war images. And the other thing I like about his constructions is you can see here he signed his name. It's actually scratched directly into the film, and their eyes would have been, I just discovered this recently, would have been scratched. And there are other ways to do that photographically, but that he's actually constructing and scratching directly into the film, and then you're getting this portrait. And the portrait has to be added to, has to be changed in order to be complete.
To create the image that's desired and that portrays what's wanted to be represented, but because the equipment isn't doing that on its own,
or we can't see it. Yeah,
we can't see it. And this, what interests me about your work is how do you think about this kind of element of media categorization? Because what you're talking about here with what Van Der Zee is doing with his photographs is something that you do when you make your film work, which is drawing or scratching into the film.
Which I only found this. Can you go to the next slide? The next slide is a loan from where I was working on an exhibition actually in the MoMA print department, and so what the great thing about prints is that it seems non-hierarchical, partly because of the curator there, Christophe Chérix, and Sarah Suzuki, but also partly because it's maybe less important than other. I mean, it's not, but I mean, there's like less
but
weight.
in the established hierarchy.
So I get to like say, oh, do you have a, and then, you know, you call up to the photo department, and this person had this photograph, which is this incredible image. This is a family portrait, again, so this is 1923, and look at this family. I mean, it's just it's like a mulatto convention. It's crazy. It's Native American, it's Filipino, it's Asian. It's just like, you know, I mean, taking Du Bois' idea of talented tenth like into the most chaos space. And the other, so they've all been constructed here. And this apparently, I just recently discovered, this would have been a portrait, and you know, it's the confetti, the satin, the silk, all the riches being shown. This would be a kind of retort to the Marcus Garvey's return to Africa. This would be about embracing American bourgeois ideals. This is about we're staying here. This is, you know, and so, you know, for this child's baptism, you know, you've got, I don't know how many people are crammed into that parlor saying we're all one family and we're staying here. This
and
is
identifying with one another, but it's sort of
it's crazy. I mean, if you look at the
that
portraits in the back of the two white men, I mean, can you imagine? They're sort of saying, "Are those my babies?" I don't know how It's a really crazy picture, but it's and this he was at his height at this time, and it's after World War II that he becomes actually bankrupt and loses his studio because this is passé. There's a kind of disappointment and
there's that moment where this kind of a heyday, I guess, of Harlem cosmopolitan society.
Well, and this idea of this new Negro. I mean, and so he's really part of this. That Harlem Renaissance was about making, you know, new. You know, this idea of, you know, now this is our construction, and it will be a construction, and it will be an obvious construction. And so I find that idea of the new Negro that appears in the ads also very interesting.
But going back to this question of the sort of idea of, we discussed yesterday maybe adding what we call a painting into this PowerPoint, and I just wanted to, you know, ask you about this, that which we haven't added, Bird in Hand, which is in the Tate's collection. And yet it uses some of the similar techniques. And I'm, you know, thinking when you make a film or when you make a large-scale work, a painting, or when you're making kind of graphic work, are you thinking about this is a drawing, this is a painting, or are you just thinking this is the visual effect? Or is this, you know, what drives the choice also between the different media?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes think that my film Murmur is, which is a singular film but made up of 5 different parts. I think of that as a, you know, as a kind of drawing, or, you know.
It involves animation and modified film.
And scratching into the film, and it's about sort of in terms of the B movie that I scratch into. It's sort of by just slightly altering it. It's, you know, and scratching into it and letting a light and characters just exist as these ghost lights through it.
With that quality of aura. That
you
saw in that.
So the next slide goes back to Drexciya, but anyway, we can.
Okay, so this is one of the drawings.
Which I consider drawings.
Yes, one of the sort of, more straightforwardly drawing, but I'm not sure any of it is straightforward in any sense,
carved
really.
And this is a detail, actually, I'm sure. This drawing was in our exhibition together, and it's my largest, well, up until 2010 was the largest water ecstatic work I'd made, so it's just impossible to see. Remember, I was so disappointed when we installed. I said, oh, it just all looks like dirty sheets of paper, and from it, you know, you really, it's not really present until you. It's
very difficult work to show in installation photographs, certainly, because it looks like there's like series of
wrinkles,
wrinkled sheets of paper in frames. But one of the things that I think this is from the photography that we did for the catalogue, where you use this raking light in order to show the way that the drawings are constructed through carving into the paper, really. Carving. So there's, you know.
It's about that kind of fetish of making. So they're watercolor, collage, and carved, really obviously carved into the paper. But the strange light was our idea. I think that you were sort of discovering something, you know, and you in the catalog. I mean, that like how we would walk through the exhibition, because so they're really, I think, with a torch. And,
very, very like raking light,
Yeah.
or like the light that you get if you're underwater as well.
Yeah.
So it was very evocative of that. So this is a series. This is the series from the exhibition Coral Cities, but you call it watery. The series of drawings is watery ecstatic, and it explores this idea of the underwater world, Drexia, for people who are not familiar with that, which is this imagined and kind of historical, based in a sort of historical reality of those people who were thrown overboard during the Middle Passage.
Or just the idea of the Middle Passage
the idea
itself.
of the Middle Passage. And that's the sort of utopia, dystopia world of Drexia.
Yeah, Drexia, I should also say, is so for me it's a collapsing. I mean, I wouldn't say this is exactly a family portrait, but it's a kind of, I mean, if we can continue looking through them, because it's a large series, but it's and you can keep moving. There's a lot of them, so you just, it's a kind of portraiture of a kind of consciousness, and for me it was about collapsing the nuke. So I'm using a lot of the faces from those magazines, and carving and drawing, and I'm also looking at scientific renderings of sea creatures, and so that kind of overview.
So this is the kind of marine biology, derived imagery.
But the idea of Drexia comes also. I'm inspired there by a Detroit-based electronic trio of electronic musicians who believe that, you know, sort of back to the effluvia, the portrait of effluvia, or the idea of the radiation coming out of those Vanderzees, the carving into, that they believe that they are channeling in their sound oral hallucinations from the Middle Passage. So that they're sound by AURAL, that they're channeling these sounds, and their sounds are this are a kind of, so their music is also a kind of making of a new Negro, where they're based in this, you know, industrial landscape of Detroit with sort of no way out, and that they're actually imagining both a gruesome past and a kind of a space, a psychic space that they can activate anew. Yeah,
but also a kind of a reclaiming of a historical narrative that is then becomes a poetic construction that allows a sort of
creation myth.
Creation.
Yeah, even if that creation then is mutant.
Yeah. So this is, you know, the fantastic kind of quality of construction here in the drawings, and some of them are completely monochrome.
So this is just completely made by carving, and it's a map and all these sort of sea creatures, mutants that can't sort of re-enter the earth again. Or, yeah.
So yeah, I was going to ask you a bit more about this idea, this kind of relationship between the poetic and the historical in your approach to particularly to geography, and the work featuring imaginary places and communities, but that also have a strong relationship to lived histories, and just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit more about that, if you have anything else to add.
Should I keep going?
Yeah, you can keep going, because we're sort of, this is Moonglow. This is, I think there's a detail. So this is larger than the last one you've seen. Again, this was made actually traveling. These portraits were made traveling, hiking in Indonesia, and looking at things through binoculars at night, and being so incredibly struck by what I was seeing. But also it was really creepy, because when you shine a torch at night, and the birds sit in the trees, and they're so, I don't know, maybe they were sleeping, or we had but so you can, it's almost, you're so close you don't even need binoculars, and as long as you remain quiet, and it's like looking at something already taxidermied, but it's just, either surprised by the light or just still, and that kind of vision, I would just come back really struck by what I'd seen, like colors and textures you would never see during the day and that you couldn't imagine. And so I tend to make these pieces and then of sequences and then reconfigure them into a larger work later in my studio. Mm-hmm.
So this is taking inspiration from your own travels and journeys.
Yeah.
And
yeah. But it's only in fragment form that it travels. So then, yeah, we can continue back to, I think then it ends at deluxe. Yeah, I think that might be the end. Oh no, there's more details, I guess, yeah. So these are, as you continue through, there are details of the pages. I mean, one of the things I found, I guess what you were saying about the poetic or the historic is moving through these magazines in the way I did, you know, at a speeded up rate, not, you know, once a month, and also looking over time periods from the 30s into the 70s. You know, you start to see that vantage points that concepts that had seemed fixed, you see them shift, and you also see a shift in the magazine from, you know, in the 30s where it's about assimilation and integration, and that's not questioned. After World War II and that disappointment, there's a projected question of, you know, a kind of disappointment and with integration, and I'm also interested in the way that the advertising, well, this is a good example of the photogravure technique where you, this additive thing where, you know, you think if you reproduce something, you lose kind of texture or quality. You know, you think of reproduction as making something distorted, and what I find really interesting about the photogravure is that because of the way the texture hits the surface, what was actually a drab, just sort of cheap lithographic magazine page, when it gets remade, the luminosities of the skin tones these are actually much more vibrant than the original.
It gives you another sort of quality to it, doesn't it? Yeah. And so the specific time period that this encompasses is very important. And I guess this kind of imagery disappears to a certain extent
Well, one thing I think that's, I mean, this has been completely mutated, and it's, but if you look at these images, you just know this is for me, I just know this is not 1970, but this is 1930. You know, maybe there's someone there from 1940, and I just thought, what is it about identity that, like, no matter what you do, you obliterate it, you create these blank spaces, but there's something that remains. And I don't know if it's the, you know, postural semantics, or, you know, the way the head is tilted, or the lighting that says 1930s. But that was really interesting to me. Like, how much could I do where there's something of this person's identity, and that she was walking around in the 30s or maybe the 40s, but definitely not the 70s, looking like that.
It still retains that historical specificity.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to me. And again, I guess that's about that overlay. I've done, you know, I've kind of created these blanks, but there is this other space that.
Yeah. I wonder whether we should open this up a little bit to if people have questions for Ellen about the work, and
just the name of the geophysicist that you mentioned.
Oh, Jacob von Narkowitz Jodko, 1896. It's that image. Kowicz. You'll find it with that. I missed an E somewhere, but it's.
Just an additional question to that is his archive available to be viewed?
From the MoMA, those portraits, yeah, you know, you can go, anybody can go view. I don't know for the photography, but you can go, I think, Mondays or Tuesdays, and you sort of have to know what you want to look for. But there are certain days of the week that both the prints, drawings, and the photographic archives of the MoMA, I mean, the collection is open. If it's on site, they'll pull it for you, and if you call them in advance, you can. And there's a viewing room, and they'll have it already set up for you, and they're quite helpful. Yeah.
Hi. I just want to ask a question about travel in your work, in the way that, that your imagery can maybe cross cultural boundaries, and that, I don't know, I suppose, what's your interpretation of that? That, it's not maybe from a fixed place, but it comes from a lot of different places in terms of cultural reference?
I don't know. I hope that's true. I mean, I hope there's a specificity in terms of it's me making it. But, I mean, I'm in the world looking at a lot of things, like other art. I mean, and so that's in there. And then I do have, this, I am looking at this, in a sense, both from the outside and from the inside, because this isn't necessarily something I was so familiar with either. In terms of the way I grew up. I didn't have these magazines until actually I started going to New York, living in New York and collecting them. But
in terms of sort of maybe other cultural experiences, like you just touched on earlier about sort of when you were in Indonesia and how that sort of influenced a particular painting.
Yeah, that certainly influenced that. I think that's in a way the most mute, sort of dumb work I've made, and I thought that was really good and interesting for me. And I think it was because it was more about just being completely overwhelmed and trying to, trying to not even make sense of what I see, but just like reorder it in this and just being so texturally overwhelmed by being out at night, along the Kinabatangan River. And in this river that's like this thick yellow soup that winds through, I mean, it's this enormous 300 miles or something of river, and that you couldn't stick your finger in it because it's like, at night you'd see eyes swimming past you. And of course you're looking in your binoculars, so they look, things look like they're giant, and then you get close and it's only that big, but this kind of, in a sense, the travel for me, one of the things, the work is really labor intensive anyway, so when I'm in my studio, there's a kind of density of time spent making work, like a series of all-nighters, that kind of create a mania in me that's really important to the work, and travel. But then I didn't want to always be that person in the studio going, you get older and you want to trigger that sense of being, elated in another way. And so for me, that physical travel, hiking, and is turned out to be, and seeing these like fleeting glimpses of things that, and under these very strange lights, that's not daylight, that's not controlled light.
And when you travel, because you do, as you were saying, travel quite often, do you ever make sketches? Do you make photographs? Do you film when you're traveling?
I film when I travel, and I never make sketches. I was admiring that with Ishmael, that he can make these really beautiful watercolor sketches. I mean, he says he does it on the road. I just don't believe him. They just look so really beautiful. You just don't, they're not what I would think of as a quick sketch, although I see the brevity and the speed in there, but they just are layered. And so for me, I will have to make a really finished, strange portrait. And so it will carry with whatever temples I'm looking at or things I'm looking at. I'll have I find that it's good to do that because you won't remember it again, and you can't really see it in a photograph again.
So do you take that back to the studio?
But then I take that thing back to the studio and cut it up and rework it. So how much it retains, I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you. You said so confidently that you called some of these works drawings, and I thought that was rather interesting.
I said what?
The identification of some of these works as drawings. We were looking at some of the beautiful, the coral water. I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more about what it is about the identity of drawings. It sounds like a struggle you've had, and you've decided to have that.
I did, at some point when I first started making works, I was drawing and onto penmanship paper on canvas. And those were, because they were on canvas, and that was just for the texture of the canvas behind it that I did that, they got classified as paintings, and I had so much drawing energy in them that I stopped drawing for a while. So it wasn't until, so there was a period of 3 years where I didn't make works on paper that I would call drawings, and I think I suffered for that. So it was something I reclaimed for myself.
And I guess it's somehow to do with scale as well. Those works are quite large scale, and penmanship paper, lots of different sheets of paper, but it somehow expands.
It becomes a total skin.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, this idea of separating things, I mean, I don't really see it as contamination of drawing or painting. You know, I don't, for me, it's just the way I work. That's what I realized. And that idea is really important to me. I mean, even in terms of how we classify, I mean, deluxe could be classified as a print, but it's also a kind of carving, I think, and a three-dimensional piece. And I think, you know, if you look at what we classify as printmaking, if you start at 1896, it gets kind of wrapped up in modernity, and the history of printmaking actually, you know, is so much older than that, that a lot of techniques get lost. So.
And yet, I think what your work really shows is how, I guess there is it's a bit pejorative to use the word contamination, but there is a sense of which, you know, techniques transfer from one context to another and bleed into one another. So there isn't necessarily a strict way of defining any of the works that you make, although they might appear at first to be in one
or you can just define them on the principles that maybe I set out, not on purpose, but over time, if you look back on a body of work, those are more like, I guess, yeah.
I'm looking at your work, and it's like past and the future is all together at the same time.
That is interesting to me. That's something I think of.
But that's what I see. But this also reminds me of the 1970s.
Really?
And I remember ladies in the 1970s wearing these beehive-type hairstyles. You know, but there also is a thing on black culture, isn't there, and hairstyles and hair being very important in black culture. Is that what you're saying?
I think hair is important in a lot of cultures. We all, you know, deal with it, and but yeah, and hair as a kind of prosthetic extension, and in this case, these are, you know, obviously, you know, coming off of the page.
But in the 1970s, women used to wear those beehives, and they looked like sculptures. They were like really like a whole bird's nest, and the whole story was going up, and they remind me of that time. And they also remind me of the 1930s, that sort of kind of mixed up. It's got multi-layers. Well, that's it, really.
I guess one of the things, you know, just thinking about what you said to begin with, about the past and the future. I mean, maybe what comes through quite strongly in your work is the past of the future. So past representations of science fiction or projections forwards is something that
I guess what I think about with making deluxe is that sometimes and seeing this this time shift, just like having access, this overview of you know, of this time frame and these pages, you know, is this idea of, you know, that somehow the present or the future can alter the past. I start to have that idea that, I mean, or at least can unfix ideas of the past.
I wanted to ask about the departmental categorization of your work. If it crosses all these boundaries, where does it fit when it's in a museum environment, like within the larger institutions? Like how is it?
Well, this work is classified. You know, if it's in the Tate, it's just in the Tate. So I like that, like, because I get to just be. But sometimes it's tricky, because this will generally be in the printmaking department, but maybe it could be in another department as well. I mean,
because it's close to some of the relief work that you've made, which is more entirely of plasticine and even.
And then the water static drawings will be classified in the MoMA as drawings department, and then the penmanship paper, which don't have, you know, any paint on them, will be called paintings. Because they're on canvas. But, you know, it just, you know...
but I'm not sure it really defines the work necessarily to
No, because and also I've been lucky. I mean that when the works have been shown, they haven't been shown like that. They've been shown generally curators pick through other departments and you know, mix it up. When my work has been shown, that's how it's been shown.
So, any other questions? Last question? Okay. Well, thank you, Ellen, very much. Oh, you have?
Oh.
Sorry, Pablo.
Oh, sorry. We didn't look over there.
I didn't see you somehow.
Yeah.
No, that I'm very interested in that you brought Ellen here, and that she in a way kind of brings another dialogue to the. So I was curious about the reason why you brought her.
I was too. That's a good question.
Well, I was trying, or we were trying to create a context around the show which wasn't entirely Latin American, and I thought with Ellen's work in particular, it crossed over with many of the different concerns within the work of different artists in this show, like the sort of, you know, Brigida's looking at kind of scientific or botanical illustrations, which is a strong element of this of the water ecstatic series, although that's more marine related. And the fact that I know that Ellen travels a lot and that has also got a relationship to her working practice, and the fact that she, drawing in a very expanded way, is quite a dominant part of the entire of her work. You know, it does appear in different ways. What you could identify as drawing does appear in different ways across many different elements of her work, from, you know, the work we just saw to the film work as well, which we haven't shown. So it was about that kind of sense of bringing also a much more expanded technique and methodological practice around, because I think that's also a characteristic of a lot of the work in the show as well, of building a much more expanded field of what we call drawing, and that's also part of the ethos of the drawing room as well.
Just expanding, I can just expand as well. One could have also linked your work perhaps to the surprising drawing that Guy showed of Pseudomeralis, which referred to an African identity. And I understand your work reworking this identity. While it is very silent, or quite silent in the dialogue that is maintained here, surprisingly, Pseudomeralis' portrait at a time when Guy said Chile and Brazil being at the forefront of modernity. And at the same time, there is this portrait that is surprising us because it has not become loud yet. So one could have also made a link from your work to this, what has been silent.
Yes, maybe just a question for you, Tanya, not so much for you, Ellen, but going back to the show as a whole, and perhaps going back to the title of the show, the Peripatetic School. I think we've said a lot about the itinerant part of that proposition, but what about the school part of the proposition? Are you perhaps thinking of effectively creating a new school of drawing in Latin America? Just a bit provocative.
Well, only in the very loosest of senses, and really it was, I guess it was going back to, you know, a definition of walking and connecting walking also with teaching that goes back to Aristotle and his school of teaching in Greece, being called the Peripatetic School because he lectured whilst walking. So it underneath that was an idea of walking in observation and of either philosophical or ontological inquiry, being very much a part of walking, and drawing as an expression of that, so drawing as the most portable tool. So that was really what it was about, you know, and maybe, yeah, that was where it kind of came from, and maybe a very loose sense of a group of people who knew about each other, and there was relationships there, but in a very loose sense.
I just had a quick question, just to clarify, for Ellen. You said that you'd made films. You talked about when you were traveling in Indonesia, you'd made films, and then you talked about making small pieces that you then work on in the studio. Mm-hmm. Are those then two-dimensional or three-dimensional? Are they coming from
the small pieces?
Yeah.
So when I'm working on them, they're two-dimensional when I'm traveling, and then when I take them home, that work Moonglow, that was three-dimensional. So things come up off of the surface of the page, I don't know, 2.5 inches at most. And that construction doesn't happen when I'm traveling. That happens later.
Okay, well, Ellen, thank you so much.
Thank you.